Hello, everybody. Welcome to UK CORRALL, the podcast that reviews all the comics written by all the British writers. I'm your co-host, Mike L., and as always, I'm joined by Adam Adamantium. That's right. And unfortunately, our co-host, Paul, Nice Man, could not join us tonight. He's under the weather. So
I guess you could say this comic made him sick.
Yeah, could be. But he'd have to read it to get sick from reading it. So I don't think he actually read it. But anyway, we'll see him in our next episode. But anyway, this is, to my knowledge, the first American published work by Peter Milligan, and that's what
I believe you're right. Yeah.
And he went on to write Shade the Changing Man, Animal Man, X-Force / X-Statix, Batman, a lot of things. And we're going to get to all of them eventually. But I do remember when this came out, I remember seeing this cover advertised probably in Direct Currents. Remember the Direct Currents?
I don't actually.
I wish I had them here. It was like a comic book sized giveaway that was maybe 4 to 6 pages. And they gave them away to all the comic shops. And it was on like a nice glossy paper. And it had like a little cover and summary of almost every DC comic every month, right?
Oh, so like an advanced trade publication, so you knew what was coming out.
Right. And I had every issue from about number 4 up, I think. And I still have them somewhere. But they're kind of a nice little collector's item because, you know, you get a little time capsule of the stuff that came out at that time. But anyway, I remember seeing this cover and not being interested in it only because, again, I was 13, 14, and I was mostly interested in superhero comics at the time. But it's a cool cover of number 1 here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it has the titular Skreemer here. We should note for those who are maybe not watching the video, maybe just listening, that it's spelt the correct way, Skreemer, because it's not screamer as in someone who's bellowing at the top of their lungs. It's a little bit different. You did mention, of course, that this is probably the first American published work that was done by Milligan, but also we need to give some credit to Brett Ewins, who did the art, the pencils on this, and fantastic stuff. I think if people aren't familiar with his work, they might know it without realizing it through 2000 AD, because he did a lot of stuff for them, including some Judge Dredd, which we might actually end up seeing some of his work later on in this show.
Excellent. He certainly is appropriate for this type of story. Now, we should point out this is pre-Vertigo, but it's May 89, so it's just when they're starting to build the foundation. In 89, we got the first issues of Sandman, Animal Man. Doom Patrol was already out, but it was probably just about to transform into Grant Morrison's revamp, right? So this is just when it was starting, and it does say suggested for mature readers on the cover, and there is some mature subject matter in here, so that doesn't surprise me. But I do appreciate that in these days, DC, I love Vertigo, but I kind of appreciate that it was just the DC Bullet, and there was nothing to earmark this as being anything different than just a DC comic. I think that's kind of cool.
No, exactly. You know, I think the Vertigo thing was great to let you know that there was going to be mature content in the work, but at the same time, it became a branding thing. And it's kind of like, you know, when you're DVD shopping, you know, remember when people bought DVDs and you'd see the Criterion collection. And it's like, you know, just because it has that branding doesn't mean it's always going to be a great quality work. You know, I've certainly been burned by some Vertigo titles in the past.
Yes.
But speaking of Vertigo, this would be reissued with that imprint on it as a trade a few years down the road. And I think it's very appropriate because tonally, in terms of the artwork, we're going to see a lot of similarities to some other popular Vertigo titles. And obviously, last week we were talking about True Faith, and that was a book that also was reissued down the road through the Vertigo imprint. I think we're going to see some thematic similarities between these works, but I'm going to argue, and giving a little bit of a spoiler for my opinion, I think it's done much more effectively in this series than in True Faith.
I would say more. Yeah, I mean, I'm assuming Peter Milligan was older than Garth Ennis was at this point, and there's definitely a maturity here, and there's a sophistication to the way the story is told that True Faith did not have.
hmm And sometimes characters talk like real people do, which is a nice change of pace, compared to what we were getting. But with that said, just overall, maybe before we get into doing a brief synopsis, because it is a 6-issue mini, but it's not that many. It's like 130 pages in the collected trade. So we're going to kind of breeze through the synopsis. I just want to get your opinion on the art, because I'm not sure. I think some people could see this and see some imperfections here and there. I, for one, actually really enjoy the penciling that's been done by Ewins. And I think the inks by Steve Dillon also give a really good mood to the series on a whole. But I'm curious what your thoughts are on the art overall.
So, okay, I first of all, I think there's one huge flaw, and it's not the fault of Ewins or Steve Dillon, and that's the coloring. I did not think the coloring was good, and sometimes the coloring was so just kind of average that it was almost confusing, because there was times where I think the coloring could have made things a little bit clearer in the story, but because it wasn't, it was a weakness. But the art itself, if I were to compare it to something, the fact that he's a 2000 AD artist does not surprise me, but it also reminds me of something like Richard Case on Doom Patrol. Only because there's a type of, like, if you look at this page here, you can't see my screen. Would you like me to share my screen? Would that help at all?
I would love that.
Okay, sure. 1 second here, folks. Just bear with us while we have. Let me know when you can see it. Can you see it?
I see the screen. Yes.
Okay. So this splash page here. There's something about Richard Case that I think the first time I read Doom Patrol I did not like about his art. But as I read it, I realized how much he contributed to the tone of the book, and I think this is a perfect example of it. There's a slight cartooniness to this guy's face, but there's also a creative use of layout and almost like I don't know, I can't explain it, but it's not trying to be superhero art. It's not trying to be noble. It's not afraid to kind of be, I guess, ugly, for lack of a better term.
I agree with you. I think there's something where, if I can use this lexicon, I think there's something kind of grotesque about the art at points.
Right.
And, I think there's something that has to be said about that, where this may be seen as sacrilege, I know, but I'm thinking of Gibbons a little bit.
Sure, of course.
Because I think Gibbons also has that line where he can do really refined art. And then there's this grotesquerie around it at points where you can really build up the mood. And I do find it's similar to what's happening here with Ewins. It has that more, I would argue, a little bit more traditional superhero style, almost exaggerated features. As you mentioned, this character's face is a bit cartoonish. But not to the point of it making it feel outlandish, but it's then juxtaposed with these very brutal images and these sort of like ugly, very almost pustule-like lines that he's marking character features with. It's, to me, I think it really sets the tone of this world that we're inhabiting, which is depraved, which is on the brink of collapse. I think it's reflected really well in the art. The coloring, it seems like average, like late 80s, early 90s DC coloring.
Yeah. And again, I'm not saying it's terrible. I'm just saying that, like you said, it's average for that time, because coloring was pretty terrible at the time, right?
You know me, I've gone on the rant about I hate when there's just a generic full color background. And, I've reeled back on that a little bit in my time, because I realized, oh no, like the Golden Age did that quite a bit, but it did it to be effective. Like you would highlight a color in the background to evoke a certain mood or atmosphere. And I do think like the pencils, like you see the background details in these scenes are fantastic. And there are parts where the colors are effective in having these more muted palettes when we get into these kind of flashback sequences. Although technically the whole thing is a flashback, but we'll get to that as we do our recount. I do appreciate that. The coloring reminds me a little bit of the technique that was used in The Killing Joke, for like lack of a better comparison point. So I didn't dislike it. I do think the whole thing looks kind of dirty and muddy with the coloring, but I think that's effective for the story that's being told too.
I agree. And it's funny because now that I'm looking at it again, maybe I was too harsh on the colorist and maybe some of it was intentional, but I don't know. Like, for example, as I'm flipping through this, which is clearly a flashback within a flashback, we're seeing green and green, kind of brownish. And I guess I just wonder if that's okay, if that was intentional, fine. But sometimes these choices are lazy, especially at this point, right?
I do agree with that. This panel that you're on right now, this page where we see the light coming through the window and the bars breaking up the beam of light behind this figure that's encroaching upon the father. That's a great example of effective use of a background and coloration that is lacking in some sequences. But, by and large, I really did enjoy the art. I do think there's a few sequences here and there that might be a little bit awkward that are attempting to show like sequential movement within a single panel by having two of the same character in it, kind of as if he's standing to the left and then he's standing to the right, indicating movement. I thought that was a little bit awkward, but on the whole, I do think if you're looking for just something that has this really good, grittier art style without getting into full like image, like, bristling muscle and veins existing on human bodies where they shouldn't. This is good.
Right, I agree. So we had talked about this before we started, and we're not going to do a panel by panel summary like usual because it's so dense. But I guess we'll say first of all that, as we mentioned, the whole story is kind of done in flashback. And apparently one of the main inspirations there's two inspirations, the book Finnegan's Wake, which I have not read. Have you?
Not yet. I've read basically everything else by Joyce.
Oh,
that is a notoriously difficult novel, just so you're aware.
Sure, yeah. I can imagine. And it was also based on the movie Once Upon a Time in America. Have you seen that?
Mm-hmm. I have, and I can see that influence. It's really apparent. And, it's also fitting that Skreemer's name, his birth name is Vito.
Was that I don't remember. Was that one of the characters in...
I thought it was one of the characters in that film.
I can't confirm that.
Or maybe I'm thinking of another De Niro movie. Then bet on me if that's the case. Yeah.
But we'll just say that Once Upon a Time in America is heavy with flashbacks, jumping back and forth between the present and the past. It's a very long movie. It's a very dense movie. And I've seen it maybe 2 or 3 times. And it's something that I think I need to see again. It's definitely not my favorite Sergio Leone movie, but I mean it's definitely effective. It's Robert De Niro, it's Joe Pesci and James Woods and Jennifer Connelly, so it's definitely worth checking out. And for some reason you can see it on Disney. I think it's because it was a Fox movie, so it's owned by Disney now.
Oh, that makes sense. Yeah.
So anyway, we're gonna jump into this. So how do you want to do this? Like, we're not gonna go panel by panel.
Maybe I'll just... Do you mind if I do the first issue and then we can kind of just show... Yeah. This is going to be a rapid review, I'll put it that way. But we start off with this figure, and he's kept inside this facility. You can see he's being tortured. This happens to be basically the assistant of Vito Skreemer, and that title Skreemer is going to come into play a little bit later. We're not told exactly what it is yet at this part of the story, but it's essentially a type of assassin or strongman for this group of what would be equivalent to a mafia in the current day. But this is a future, perhaps an alternative present. It's not quite clear, but it's one in which this basically cabal of gangs are run by heads of these groups, which are called presidents. And so the Skreemer is kind of the main assassin or bodyguard for the Skreemer. And this one follows what is essentially the story of the final Skreemer. So anyway, this person is taken in to be tortured by someone named Victoria. And we're going to learn about how all 3 of these people and their lives were intertwined at a certain point of their existence. But this is nonlinear. We need to stress this. This goes between flashbacks, different characters' perspectives. If it seems a little bit frenetic with how we're going to encapsulate what's happening, that's because that's the nature of the book itself. But basically what happened was this individual was taken in to be tortured after this attempted hit that was made on this group that belongs to the Skreemer, who is basically the king criminal of the world, and not even so much a criminal. He's kind of like the ruler of this adjunct New York style city. It might actually be New York, but I don't think it's ever actually named what it is. Mm-hmm. The individual who is captured and tortured and whose recounting we're actually experiencing, his name is Dutch. And Dutch is just recalling what happened. There was this series of exploding meat. This was kind of done with something that I thought was clever, where there's this genetically modified meat that explodes, and it basically disrupts this big function that Dutch is at, along with a lot of the acolytes of the Skreemer.
Did I skip over that already? I don't remember.
You might have just done that.
Okay.
It should be on page 7. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, here it is.
So this does set up that there is this incredible biotechnology that's happening at this point. But this whole thing with the stakes and the meat exploding is just a cover so these people can come in and apprehend Dutch and take him away to be tortured. Now, near the end of the issue, what we're experiencing is a very grotesque scene where Dutch is kept inside a crucifix-like binding unit, and a giant, fleshy, pustule-covered rat is being fed into a cage that's surrounding his head as a form of torture, because Victoria, this woman that's torturing him along with her other agents, they need some information about Skreemer. Now, this is interspliced with sections of Skreemer talking. One of the big things you'll notice is that he's constantly looking over this railless, barrierless edge that he stands upon in his tower. And thematically, this will come into play very soon as we get more of his backstory. But we're also introduced to some other characters that play a part. There's Glorine, who is the mistress and also mother-to-be for Skreemer's child. And then we also have another assistant named Finnegan. Finnegan is just basically looking after Glorine, making sure that she's okay. And she is soused. She's drinking. She's making basically all sorts of derogatory, horrible remarks about Skreemer. But he is so in his head, Skreemer's not even acknowledging it. And we see more of this kind of, I guess you could say, weird intersection of characters, including a character named McAdams, who comes in, who is a scientist and another associate of Skreemer's. So far, everything is very nebulous. We don't really know the full connections of these people. And we get yet another flashback, but this time from the perspective of Vito Skreemer, as he's remembering his upbringing. He remembers this plague, which he keeps referring to as the Fall. And this is going to be evoked many times throughout the story during these flashbacks, where he's living with his father in this derelict building. His father is murdered by this homeless person, and ultimately Vito, to save himself, ensnares this person in a series of bear traps and beats him to death. That might actually be in the next issue, but the setup is there. But what's interesting, and again, this is very frenetic, I know, but this is paired also with flashbacks from someone who we don't actually know who yet. Mm-hmm. What's really clever is at first, it makes it seem as if this recounting right underneath the panels of Vito Skreemer is a continuation of his story. But we start realizing as the dialogue panels go on, this is another person recounting their own bringing up in this post-fall world where plague and disease has affected this New York adjacent city. And it's actually another couple. So we have this unknown person suddenly giving their own background. And we end up finding out that this person is the grandchild of someone named Charles Finnegan, which, as you remember, was also the name of the person that was assisting Glorine earlier in this novel.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Anyway, there's some back and forth. Because of this fall, it's gone to basically affect all this horrible economic circumstances within the city where people are poor, people are fighting amongst each other for scraps, and basically this individual, this Peter Finnegan, takes on this job to transport what he is told is liquor from one district to another, but he hears noises in the back of the truck, and opening it up, he sees a group of young girls. And this revelation leads him to return to the bar, to attack the person who hired him to transport the girls because apparently what was happening is that they were all being transported for the sex trade. And we're seeing this amazing caricature of Peter being built up, where he's this very ethical minded person, that he has this clear idea of right and wrong, which seems at odds with everyone else surrounding him. So much so that he packs up his family and he leaves the district after he's fired and threatened by the bar owner, saying the person who was supposed to receive these young girls for the sex trade is going to be after him, so he better leave. And again, this goes back to another flashback from Vito Skreemer, where that aforementioned attack by a person that ends up with Skreemer bludgeoning and killing the person who killed his father is recalled. And the issue essentially continues with these flashbacks, where we see the flashbacks now of Dutch as him and this young gang are just trying to survive in this post-fall world. They get into a scrap that ends up with them being shot at, and they run away to a rooftop where they are saved and helped by a young Vito Skreemer. And what we realize is this is the three central characters of this story, or at least three of the four central characters. So we have Vito, we have Dutch, and Victoria, who, as we remember, was the woman that brought in Dutch to be tortured. And then the rest of the novel, this issue, of the graphic novel, ends with Vito Skreemer in a fantastic pimp-style outfit, bursting through the door with a big gun to see Dutch incapacitated. He has the cage over his head. This is just one issue, so this gives you an idea of how dense this is.
So now that I've read the whole series, I'll just say, as we're flipping through these pages, these images come up again and again, as you said, standing at the ledge. Like these. Okay, so I'll just say that the first thing I'm going to say is that I could only assume there's an influence of Alan Moore's Watchmen on this, with the way that Dr. Manhattan flashes back and forth between the past and the present and in the future, which is going to come to play later on with the Skreemer character as well. But we'll just say that this is a very intricately plotted out story that you can only do if you know the end before you start, the beginning. Like, it's plotted in a way that Peter Milligan knew exactly how everything was going to fit together, I can assume, as he was going along. And so he's foreshadowing a lot of what's to come. He's cutting back and forth between things that have happened. And as you said, characters are introduced, and we kind of find out more about them as they go along. So it's a very dense read. And I did enjoy it, but I was also confused by it, partly because, like a certain other co-host, I left this until this weekend to start reading. And so I had a very busy weekend, so I was kind of fitting it in between doing other things. And so I definitely don't think I gave it the full attention that I could have, or I wished I could have. But I did enjoy everything I read. And I always, I compare these UK writers to this is like a screenplay to me, and I see it as like a perfectly realized screenplay. And to me, this would make a great 3 or 4 hour movie.
And, also, I think this does some great things in terms of the artwork that I always look for. What does a comic book do that a movie can't? And there was a sequence earlier on where we have a character that is in a butcher's shop, and he is juxtaposed to another panel right before him where Dutch is being held up by his feet and is being bludgeoned and tortured. That's the implication. Then we have someone, right there. What a great contrast, and what a great thing that can only happen in comic books, having these two images side by side. To me, not only does this show that Milligan really knew how to plot out the story, but it shows that Ewins really knew the language of sequential art to have this sort of contrast in there.
Agree. A movie could show one image after the other. They could maybe show it split screen, but yeah, it's best done in a comic book, right?
I think this is what the ultimate thing that I can say as a compliment is I would rather see this just stay as a comic than as a movie, because I think it would just be inferior if it was. And that's my ultimate compliment I can give any sequential art. But I do think while this was dense, when we get into the next issue, because we've already established so much of what's happening with these characters, the story is going to make a little bit more sense, and maybe it's going to be a little bit clearer during this recounting. But rather than talk too much about this issue, I'd kind of want to give my thoughts at the end,
Sure.
because I did the opposite of what you did, which is I sat and had one complete reading of all 6 issues. So I feel like my experience might have been a little bit different. Yeah.
Ah, interesting. Okay.
Which I will recommend. Yeah.
Well, I thought you were going to say the opposite. I think you were going to say you spread it out and read like one per week or something, which, no, I guess you wouldn't have time to do that. But anyway, one per day maybe. But no, okay. Yeah, it probably is better to do it in one sitting. You're right. Okay, well, so here's the thing. I honestly don't think I have the capability to summarize. Would you like to keep going and summarize the next issue?
Okay, I don't know how much people love hearing my voice, but I will try my best.
And I can jump in, like I can give comments as we go if you like.
No, that would be great.
Sure.
So the next issue is Vito, who's recovering Dutch from his torture. As he exits the building, Dutch is just revealing what happened so that Vito is caught up, which is that there is this cabal of presidents, as we mentioned, these sort of gang leaders, and they're basically looking to overthrow the power that Vito Skreemer has. This is interspliced, of course, with flashbacks about the past, about Dutch and Victoria and Vito being together. And you get this really bittersweet story being told of this gang of youth coming together under these dire circumstances, contrasted with the horribleness of their situation, and contrasted further by how there's this schism between them now in the present. Some details are shared which give great characterization, such as Dutch's fear of rats, which is why they tortured him with a rat in a cage. Also, it shows them being part of this young gang that are just trying to survive in this world, which is derelict and abandoned by seeming law and order. And again, we continue seeing flashbacks of Peter Finnegan, whose daughter is dying or is apparently very ill, but it appears she is at death's door. He needs to find some sort of way to get her medicine. So he goes out and he stumbles upon a man with a bottle of liquor. And because of the scarcity of stuff that's available, such as food and drugs and alcohol, he knows he'll be able to get quite a bit of money for this, and maybe even medication to treat his daughter. He ends up fighting the man for the bottle. And unfortunately, as we're going to see later on, he's too late to save his daughter. By the time he gets back, she's dead. And so this attack he had on this man was for nothing. But again, this is not a linear narrative, because this is interspliced with the flashbacks of what we're having with Vito and Dutch and Victoria as they're robbing people, as they're breaking into chemists' stores in order to just find any sort of means to get by, whether it's money, food, medicine. And this particular stick-up goes awry. Vito ends up killing not only the husband who owns the shop, but his wife, who is behind the counter, who is pregnant. And he gives no regard to the life of her child. He just kills her in cold blood, which begins the slow fissure between him and Victoria and Dutch, as we're going to see. And that's going to be elaborated as the story goes on. There's also repeating visual motifs. Jesus on the cross is something that is heavily depicted, and we already saw that in the opening panel of this first issue that we just recounted with Dutch in that crucifix-style pose. But this goes on, and as these characters continue recounting their past, we end up also getting an idea of how Vito became a Skreemer. He basically killed a president. And again, keeping in mind, presidents are kind of these gang leaders. He killed another Skreemer. And that apparently is an initiation. Once you kill a Skreemer, you are seen as being worthy of being a Skreemer. And so he's brought in by one of the presidents. He's tortured. And this is all just done to test his mettle. One of these goons that's torturing him slashes his face, which is the origin of this prolonged scar that he has across his visage, which is one of his key character traits. He even puts the blade of the knife just a millimeter up to his eye, threatening him, but Vito does not flinch. And so ultimately he's accepted to become one of the Skreemers. And this continues to be contrasted with this sort of downfall of what's going to happen with Peter Finnegan as he descends into drink and he descends into all sorts of rabble because of the death of his daughter. It's severely impacted him. Now, as we go on, we end up seeing the main schism erupt between Dutch, between Victoria, and between Vito. And basically what happens is Dutch has feelings for Victoria. He is attracted to her, but what ends up happening is that he does not have a chance to act upon it. Vito sleeps with her before he has a chance to act upon it, and she basically becomes his consort. And then after that, Vito betrays her. He makes a choice between her and somebody else. And even though we see this rise of him through the ranks of the criminal organization in the city, we see this downfall of his interpersonal relationships. And this is where we start seeing the stories intersect as well, because this flashback with Skreemer starts entering into Peter Finnegan's flashbacks, where at this point Finnegan is running a bar and Skreemer comes in, killing the clientele and also his son, just saying that a new president owns this territory and he's not allowed to sell liquor here without his consent. So we're seeing the first webs being woven between here. It's, as you said, intricate is the word, as we're seeing all these story threads just bind together. And as these flashbacks diverse, going back and forth between these other characters, within the present, we see Skreemer talking to McAdams about some sort of project, but it's not made clear yet exactly what it is. But it's contrasted with Victoria and this cabal of other presidents who are planning to overthrow him. And they're going to have a vote to decide exactly how this will occur. We also find out the full name of the person who's basically trusted to take care of Glorine, who is, again, the woman who has Skreemer's child, and that is Timothy. And as we learned from the flashback, Tim was the name of Peter Finnegan's son who was killed in that bar fight. So we're kind of confused as what exactly is happening. Mm-hmm. It's clarified later on that actually Peter had another son that he named after his deceased child, and by all accounts, this is that son. So we're now seeing further threads woven together. Mm-hmm. And that's the end of that issue. So,
I don't know. Do you want to give comments on this at all, or you want us to keep going?
I feel like I don't really have a lot to say. Okay. Individual issues. I will in a few instances, but for this one, I love how the flashbacks intersperse with each other. Mm-hmm. There is no attempt to say this section is for this character, this section is for this one. They bleed into each other, showing how deeply connected they are. And also it becomes slightly disorienting, but not in a way I dislike, in a way where I think it's leaving a lot of confidence in the reader to be able to parse it out. Yeah. What are your thoughts on it?
Well, I mean, yeah, you feel like you're in safe hands because everything is so organized, right? I was confused, but I also was intrigued by everything that was going on and the way it was happening. But we can talk more about everything else later. But yeah, definitely, again, I always put this in the context of when it came out, and it's just shocking to think that this was on the stands at the same time as stuff like Invasion. Remember that?
Oh, yes.
And Millennium and whatever else DC was doing at that time. So anyway, it's just shocking. But okay, yeah, so we'll jump right into... You want us to keep going then?
Yeah, this one I think is actually going to be quicker to recount because basically we're just seeing the story beats continue to connect. So we're getting more backstory between all these characters. Dutch is finally awake and he has a heavily bandaged face after all the torture that he went through. He starts recounting a lot of what's been happening to Vicky, who's sitting next to him. But she's not really. She's a hallucination. And we start seeing the fragility of Dutch's mind as he's just recounting his past. And we're also getting clues to what exactly Skreemer's scheme is. Again, nothing is revealed fully, but there's an implication that it has something to do with balloons. So there's a little bit of a Joker vibe here, but we'll get to that in a moment. This issue focuses a lot on the upbringing of Tim Finnegan, who is, of course, the new child of Peter Finnegan, whose story we've been having recounted to us. His upbringing is interspliced with Glorine, who is, again, talking to the grown-up Peter Finnegan and just talking about how she hates the prospect of having this man's child. She sees Skreemer as a monster. She refers to the thing inside of her body as an abomination, as something disgusting. And we're getting this contrasted again with the upbringing of young Tim. And we see what's happened in the world around them, where there was a president named President White, who basically assumed the majority of power within the city. So he kind of became the overarching kingpin of the city. And that's the mantle that Skreemer has inherited. We don't know the full story yet of how he's done that, but that will be revealed soon. So as the stories are being recounted, Dutch removes the bandages from his face and he sees how deformed he is. He sees just how disgusted his reaction is to his reflection. And it's this incredible pathos of seeing him in that state. And before this, we get a little bit as well of Skreemer's past conquests, where he's looking for someone to have his child. And we see this one woman that he was in a relationship with. She ends up being killed in this hit inside this bar. And the child that she was pregnant with also dies as a consequence of that.
Did I skip over that, or? I
think it's coming forward a little bit. Because again, there's a lot of recounting Skreemer's like rise to prominence as a Skreemer. He really is a president, for lack of a better term. Like, he is like that degree of power, but he still holds on to that mantle of Skreemer, maybe because there is something to it, like a certain edge of violence or like power that comes with it.
Okay. Oh, and here's that scene. Yeah. And so, for example, like the scene of him revealing his face, it's spread out over many, many pages, right? It's slowly cut back and forth. And then we have the scene now with the girl in the bar.
Yeah, and then we don't really get a reaction from Skreemer about this. Nothing really tangible. Although while there's this sort of cold facade that he adopts around people, we see him kind of devolving into these episodes where he's talking to himself and he's screaming out. And so we get the sense that there is something more to him, maybe some trauma or something else that's yet to be revealed to the reader. But we can't quite focus on that yet. We have to focus instead back to President White, who is renamed Tiberius White because of the depravity that he runs himself through in his private life. He has all sorts of horrible, violent, and sexual escapades that he enacts, and that includes the revelation that he wants to kidnap people and put them through humiliating sexual acts in order for him to have amusement. And his next thing that he wants is a set of twins, a male and female twin, to have sex in front of him. Yeah. What we see is that these twins were actually the children of Peter Finnegan. We've seen the twins throughout the story so far as young children, and this is a stage where the story's progressed enough. They're now adults, and thankfully Peter comes in, he intervenes, he says that they're not going to kill his children, they're not going to make them do anything so depraved. But what is going to be the consequence of this? Well, what happens is Vito Skreemer gives him a knife, and he says, you have to make a choice. You can either kill these other two children here, and we'll let you go. Or if you don't, we're going to kill your children. So what will you do? And so Vito puts him in this horrible moral dilemma. And ultimately, he makes a decision in the next issue. But this is a hell of a cliffhanger to leave off on.
This is, I must admit, I've read a few comics in my day. This is one of the most horrific scenes I've seen in a comic. Not just the choice, but the way it plays out, and we'll get to that, but it's pretty haunting, I must say, hey?
It's very haunting. You know, I think we talked about Ennis a little bit, and you know, he has a tendency to have a lot of debaucherous and very provoking imagery in his work, but I feel like sometimes it's used for a sense of dark humor, and it doesn't really land with me, which is why I'm critical of, some of his stuff.
Sure.
I am not with this. I think this is where it's done effectively, where the audience is aghast. Certainly me as a reader, I was. And I just realized how deplorable of a state that this person was put in, an impossible decision to make.
And I think, even though I do love Ennis, yeah, there's always that sense. I mean, if you want to do a spectrum, it's like Mark Millar's on the one extreme side, and Garth Ennis is in, but he's a much better writer, but he sometimes goes to the extremes that Miller does. Whereas this feels like I'm only feeling fear and pity for the characters. I'm not feeling manipulated. Right?
That might be the best way to put it. Like, I feel there's more confidence given to me as a reader to be able to handle the material.
And also, I feel, especially with Mark Millar, where I feel like he's showing off. Like, look how shocking I can be. Look how crazy my imagination is. And it seems more like it's about him and him showing off. This feels more like Peter Milligan's forcing us to imagine ourselves in this situation. And it's different. It's a different way of using it.
I agree. I think it asks something else of the reader. It asks them to place themselves in a horrible situation and not to be provoked or not to like give the thumbs up of, yeah, you're a really cool edgelord, but to actually provoke them to think, oh God, what could I do in this situation? And how fathomable is it that there would be people like this that would actually force me to do something? Yeah, it's very harrowing. The next issue I'm going to blaze through as well.
Sure.
Again, we're getting so much recounting of characters past, and I want to say this is well worth reading because the character development is incredible in it as we get these interspliced flashbacks. But I do want to mention that the issue opens up with the image of a balloon, and this is, again, that illusion that we were hearing before about this balloon, and this is all tied into this scheme, this plan that Skreemer has that, again, we still do not know what it is. We should mention at this point, Glorine has gone into labor to give birth to Skreemer's child. And as that happens, we find out more about the decision that was made by Peter Finnegan. He made the decision he had to, which was so hard on him that it broke him. That decision was he killed those other children to save his own. So he murdered them, stabbing them in front of his own children, in front of everyone else that was in front of President White, and he goes mad because of it.
And I just want to say, at first he offers himself. He says, I'll slit my own throat, and you can let all the kids go.
Yes.
And then Skreemer says, no. You chose not to kill them, so yours die. Life's so simple, isn't it? And so then it cuts away. And I want to just drive home this point because this shows how well the cutting is. But it cuts away, and so you're like, oh no, what's going to happen? And then when it cuts back, we don't see him kill them. We only see the blood on his coat. And we see his two children alive, so you know what happened.
Yeah, I feel if this was like a Mark Millar story, he would want everything in full gratuitous violence. He would want to do that for pure shock value. We don't need it. The concept itself is horrendous enough that we don't need that gratuity, because when you show that, what you're really implying is this is edgy, but it's kind of cool, right?
Yep.
This story is showing there's nothing cool about it. What we're getting is just the repercussions of this decision. And it's funny you mentioned Watchmen definitely being an influence on this. I see that as well, and I think that shows a lot. When you get into, I think it's page 7, or maybe it's a little bit later than page 7. It's page 8. Basically, Vito is recounting his childhood where he found a dog and he just tortures it. Again, a little bit of evocation of what happens with Rorschach. I also like the restraint that's shown with Ewins' pencils, because you could show the goriest, most horrendous visage of this dog being tortured. It's obscured in shadow, so I appreciate that. There's a bit of tact used for that. But what happens is this revelation where he says, after the dog died, the death tattoo, which is the spattering of blood on the wall, revealed something to him. And this is part of I don't want to say a twist, but part of something that's binding everything together.
Mm-hmm. And also, you mentioned the dog. We also have to talk about the child staring at the blood splatter on the wall. Reminds me a little bit of, I believe it was Rorschach seeing the silhouette, the shadow of his mother making love to a man on the wall. Do you remember that?
Oh, yes, I do. And then there's also spoilers for anyone who's not read Watchmen. Spoilers for a 40-year-old book. But, after he kills this dog and he looks into its collapsed skull, he sees these other shapes and evocations. And I wonder if this is also somewhat influenced by that.
Yeah. And even just throwing the dagger and kind of cutting back to the dagger. And again, I'm not criticizing it. I'm saying, do it. Like, why not absorb those influences and use them in a different way, right? Like, it's great.
I agree with you. And I think even though you can kind of see where the influences came from, it uses them very effectively. Mm-hmm. And what I really like is how it ties in with its own themes here. On this page, too, what we see is the part where Skreemer now attacks President White. He's taking over his organization. And what we see, because President White is named Tiberius White, like the famous Roman emperor that was just all about debauchery, and he'd have these large orgies and parties at all times. So every single day is like a birthday party for President White, where there's balloons and streamers everywhere. And he's surrounded by balloons in this flashback. And again, it's calling back to the balloons that are part of this plot that Skreemer is going to have. Also, you're on a great page, too, where we see a fantastic use of the sequential medium between these three panels, these three depictions of Skreemer in different times. The flashback to him as a child, him after having killed President White, and then him in the present day. It's wonderful. I love it. It's just such a great evocation of how these past iterations of him are all connected and how it makes him still who he is to this day. As I said, basically, because of his decision to kill these children, Peter Finnegan, he goes mad and he starts just drinking and he abandons his family. So that's part of his flashback sequence. Again, Glorine is in labor, so we're seeing her and Timothy Finnegan have a budding relationship and friendship as the two commiserate with one another. But what also happens to transpire during all of this is a revelation of another sort. And that is kind of fascinating for me, where Vito was attempted to be assassinated at some point in the past. We have yet another flashback where he was shot through the stomach. And despite everything, he managed to survive. This flashback is great for evoking not only what's going to happen at the end of the series, but also contrasting to the current plans that these presidents have to overthrow his own power. And we keep seeing these conversations between this cabal of presidents, including Victoria, as I mentioned, where they're trying to decide who's going to be the person to overthrow him, who's going to take his territory. And then, of course, also intersplicing this with Skreemer talking to McAdams about the plot that this is going to be going on. Mm-hmm. So what happens is he realizes that his current whereabouts places people within danger. So he sends Timothy and Glorine out to go to a safe space. As they travel, Timothy recalls his past, and we also get basically this recalculation of what's happened to Peter Finnegan, his father. And what we see is after years of being destitute and drunk, he has a vision in a church of an angel. And it turns out to be actually a woman who's just covered in robes. She's kind of pox-ridden and covered in scars, but he kisses her thinking she's an angel initially, and that just is an act of kindness that makes her cry, and is so grateful for the first time ever to have someone kiss her and want to be close to her. And this kind of snaps him out of his depression, and he realizes he can still enact positive change. And so he goes home and returns to his wife and to his son, Timothy. But the issue ends with a series of balloons covering New York City. It's a very ominous sight. It's one of those liminal things where you shouldn't see so many balloons in the sky. When you do, there's something just so off-putting about it. It's very creepy. And wow, what an issue.
And also with their variation on the American flag on them, right?
Exactly, which is kind of like a bullet point, I guess you could say, or like a bullet target. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. All right, we're on number 5. Want to keep going?
Let's do this. Okay. Yeah. So again, speeding through, we're just getting more of the background on Timothy and his relationship with his father, which was very strained to the point where Timothy left home because he couldn't really abide by his father much longer, and he decides to start working for the Skreemer. But as this is happening in the flashbacks, we're also seeing a real I guess you could say current situation where the car he and Glorine are being driven around in is attacked by other people. And so he has to protect Glorine. He ends up managing to save her, even though the other people in their car die, and as do the attackers. Now, with that said, we start hearing a little bit about Skreemer's ideas about how he perceives the world. Mm-hmm. He talks about this torture that happened of this one person and how their intestines were ripped out of them. And he starts really waxing poetic on it, where it is revealed that he sees something in that. And again, this evokes the blood splatter from when he killed the dog as a child. He's talking about how he sees things within these patterns. There's some sort of point to this. And again, it's kept very vague, but essentially what this leads to is the fact that he ends up being able to, or so he says, he remembers from that moment seeing the blood splatter on the wall that he could see the future. Mm-hmm. So this is interesting because up to this point, we had seen some panels in the flashbacks of his father dissecting animals, and it wasn't really made clear why that is. It is revealed that his father was some sort of scientist and that he dissected and vivisected animals as part of his career. And it's heavily implied that during this time when he was post-fall, when he was just doing this on whatever rodents and vermin he could get his hands on, that he was telling his son that he could tell the future, do sort of a soothsaying from this situation where he's pulling out the intestines and he's able to tell the future. And that is what Vito Skreemer is claiming. He's also able to do the same thing. Mm-hmm. And so everything that's happened, he's foreseen. So I don't know how you feel about that. It's quite a twist that seems to come out of nowhere, but I think it's very fascinating because it shows that basically everything that happened was of his direction. What do you think about that?
Well, okay, I'll say one thing. Other than Batman, the first Peter Milligan story I read was Animal Man. Did you read his follow-up to Grant Morrison's Animal Man?
Only the first couple issues. I just didn't have a chance to read the rest.
So he only did about 6 maybe. But
okay,
what I noticed about that was that it felt like there was 5 issues of mystery, and then at the very last issue, you found out the twist that explained everything, which is a little bit like this. But I guess my only complaint was that there wasn't enough clues that you could have put it yourself together. You couldn't have put it together yourself. So is that what you're?
I have an idea that I'm going to share at the end of the next issue, but I was curious because it seemed also at ends with everything else. I mean, even though this is a science fiction future story, it's all based upon like reasonable technology and sort of like things that could happen, such as plagues, such as like economic collapses. Having someone being able to tell the future is a little bit out of the realm of realism that the story is entrenched in. But, I'll get to my thoughts on that in a little bit, because it felt like it took me out of the story a little bit at the time, but I'm going to share some thoughts on that later.
Sure. I'll just say that this fits with, I think, because Peter Milligan's always been up there for me. He's never been my favorite writer, but he's certainly up there. But I think maybe that's a weakness that I think he has is his stories are certainly complicated, but sometimes, I think the explanation is not as organic as it could be for the twists that he has.
Yeah, and you know what? I don't disagree with that. I've certainly read that in some of his works. So this one I might not be so harsh on, but I'll tell you why in a little bit. something else I should mention, that because the presidents are planning this attempt to have a coup, they are attacking the city. So there's a lot of gang warfare occurring right now within the streets. And also what's happening is Victoria is being betrayed by one of her fellow presidents. They were supposed to work together to usurp power, and he basically assassinates her drivers. He plans to attack her, and this is the one sequence where it's a very dark story, and there's a lot of horrendous stuff that happens in here, but there is this scene where he's about to sexually assault her, which I felt was a bit unnecessary.
That's earlier, right? I passed by.
It is a little bit earlier than this, yeah. And I'm always a proponent to say, if you have to make a choice between having a sexual assault in a story or not, don't, because I don't think, unless you use it very effectively, it doesn't add much to it, aside from just being like, isn't this guy a real scumbag? Don't you really want him to get it? Right. And he gets it. He gets attacked by a dog and he gets eaten, and Victoria gets away before anything can happen. It also felt like it kind of came out of nowhere, and it didn't really seem to serve the rest of the story. So when I say it felt unnecessary, just not because I don't like that trope, which I don't. It also didn't seem to add much to the overall accumulation of what was happening. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So I think if I have a major nitpick or criticism about this story, it might be that sequence, because it seemed unnecessary. But, with that said, just going forward for what we see about the rest of this narrative, we are having a contrast in flashbacks between how Skreemer ended up seeing Glorine originally, how he wanted to have a child with her, and then with her actually giving birth, because she's, as I said in the last few issues, she's been going through labor. Again, as we continue on through all these flashbacks, we get to the point where Skreemer has devolved his plan, where he's had McAdams make these balloons that have these biological agents within them. And the biological agents are going to create havoc, basically keeping the world in the same sort of disarray and plague-ridden state that it is now. Because as things progress, he'll lose power as things become more stabilized. He talks to McAdams about how he betrayed him, because he realized throughout all of this, McAdams was a plant that was in there that was betraying him, that was feeding information to the outside presidents, that allowed attacks on him, that allowed other things such as Dutch being kidnapped and tortured. And ultimately, McAdams reveals that the balloons, which are exploding now overhead of the city, are not full of biological agents. They're just benign bacteria, because he did not want to be responsible for the type of horrible things that Vito wanted. This is interesting, because this contrast with Vito's claims that he can tell the future, we're going to get to that point in the next issue. But this issue starts wrapping up, not only with the revelation of McAdams' betrayal, not only with taking Dutch out to the roof, but then also with the birth of his child. And that leads into the final issue, issue 6 of Skreemer.
Mm-hmm. All right.
Okay, and again, we have a conflict. We have this conflict between Dutch and between Vito, where Vito is again talking about how he's planned everything out, he's foreseen the future, and Dutch is calling him out on it. He's saying, well, how is that possible? Why did you say that you could see the future, and yet this woman that he was going to have a child with ended up being hit and attacked within a bar? How did they know that she was going to be at this bar? Did you give them information? He starts talking about, well, if you knew the future, then why did you know this biological agent was going to not be released? And basically the implication that Dutch gives, which I think resolves a lot of the issues for the story, is that despite what Vito is claiming, he doesn't actually see the future. He makes himself believe that he does. Because throughout all of this, throughout the explanation that his father's vivisection has allowed him some sort of prescient knowledge over the future, we see plenty of instances where he doesn't. And this is the one thing that I really did appreciate about this. It's left ambiguous. Mm-hmm. If you want to read into it that he can actually be this sort of soothsayer, and that's how he's been able to attain this power, you can. Or it could just be the times that he was lucky, it was just luck. And there's plenty of instances where you can see where he was not able to tell the future, or on sub-unconscious level, he was trying to plan his own downfall.
Okay.
So I'm not saying that's the definitive
Sure.
answer for
Yeah.
this, but I appreciate again that Milligan leaves this as a kernel of possibility.
Sure.
And
Which
yeah.
also makes it kind of better because it grounds it a little bit more, right? I think that's always the best way to handle any fantastic, like not like a superhero story, but like something like a ghost story, where if you leave that kernel of possibility that it could all be in their heads, it grounds it a little bit more.
I agree, and that's why I love this. I talk a lot about how I wish authors would use ambiguity correctly, and this is what I mean. Not where it seems like, oh, you brought up a bunch of things, but what do they actually mean? But to the part where you brought up a lot of things that have multiple possibilities of how they can be interpreted, and they all work in one way or another. Oh, and we should also mention that throughout the story, Skreemer's been talking about how he killed his mother. She died during childbirth, and his father was so distraught over this act that he held the young Skreemer over the edge of a barrister-less stairwell, and he was contemplating just letting him drop. And that is why he's constantly standing on the edge of all these different surfaces. Skreemer is feeling like he's inevitably going to have this fall, that he's going to stare over the abyss. And, you know, part of what's happening is he feels like he knows his fate. He knows that he will inevitably reach this abyss, that he'll die. And part of these series of plans that he has is the slow embracing of what he can do to eventually like meet this end of his, but also meet it on his own terms. It's very complicated, and it's something that is done exceedingly well, I feel.
And I'm skipping through here, but now have I skipped over because his father was holding him at the edge, but then they jumped away. Maybe they don't go back to it. No, I don't think they do, eh?
No, well, there's a brief evocation of it later on, but that really comes with the next story beat. Because as we mentioned, he's having a child. Or, well, that would be interesting. That would be like a comic book version of Junior. But no, Glorine is having his child. And he reveals that in that original murder that he committed of that woman in the at the pharmacy, he did see that there was something that he had to do, that he had to basically do something to the future. And when he first met Glorine, he saw this phantom child within her. Again, part of him being the soothsayer. And it was part of him basically wanting to create this other future, this possibility. To quote him, "If I can escape destiny once, my destiny will crumble. I'll be free." And he's looking at this as a way to kind of circumvent destiny, to continue his lineage through this child. Ultimately, what happens, though, is that Glorine does give birth, again, interspliced with these scenes of this gang war as Victoria leads people into Vito's sanctum. And what happens ultimately is Vito, during these attacks, he is shot. He jumps over the edge of a building, and he survives. He survives by clasping onto the building across from him. And he has this sudden realization that this should have been it. The abyss, this should have been my end. But I've escaped it. I've cracked the future. I'm free. And so there's this kind of mad glee as he realizes, you know, maybe there is no fate. Maybe I can circumvent this. Then he goes to the hiding place where Glorine was with Tim Finnegan, and he reveals that the baby, it's not revealed what the baby looks like. She's obviously very deformed or is in some sort of state where he looks at this baby and you can tell there's some sort of physical problem with it. And he is distraught. This is the first time we actually see Skreemer seem like he has this emotional resonance, this acceptance of something. And ultimately he embraces the abyss because, as he says, he could hear laughing the abyss. It was laughing and whispering, "You fool," as he stands over what appears now to be the same building that him and his father had inhabited all those years ago, over the same landing without the railing. And he steps over, killing both himself and the child. It's a very harrowing sequence, and page 24 is one of the best splash pages I've ever seen. Just a full body of Vito falling with the child clutched in his arm, this swirling of other panels behind him of these flashbacks as he's about to collapse into the ground.
Right.
And the story ends with Victoria taking over the post of Skreemer. She wants to be able to work with Dutch, but he just walks away from her. He obviously has a sense of dignity, and he does not want to put himself to be under anyone's thumb again. And then Timothy returns home. As mentioned, he had abandoned his father to work for Skreemer, but he comes back with Glorine, who becomes his wife, and the family reunites. And there's this very heartwarming scenario, this heartwarming scene after all this depravity and after all this horribleness. And what we see is that the narrator of the story was the child of Timothy and of Glorine, because he keeps mentioning his grandfather being, of course, Peter Finnegan. That's because this is the surviving child. This is what broke the future, this hope. And while this family that basically embodies the hope for understanding and a future of community and togetherness, the story ends with a final sequence of Vito and his dead child sprawled out on the floor. Mm-hmm. And showing basically the end of this tyrannical reign, and also the end of the idea of the only way to crack the future is through despotism and violence. That's all about Skreemer. Mike, I'm sure people are sick to death of hearing from me.
No.
What are your overall thoughts?
Well, I guess strangely, this story is actually very timely.
Oh, yes.
Because of everything that's going on. The fact that they are called presidents, the fact that, I mean, I just watched a really good discussion with, I can never remember his name, but he's one of the four horsemen of atheism. I can't remember which one he is, but he's the young guy. And, okay, but he had a guest on, and he basically made the point that a certain president of a certain country is running their country as if they were a mob boss. And using that to explain why he treats his enemies with more respect than he treats his allies, which is because he sees his enemies as equals, because they're other mob bosses with other families. Mm-hmm. And that feels so timely here. And just the fact that the story ends on this note of hope is actually very, I guess you could say, life-affirming after all of this misery, right? It's like Children of Men. It's just nothing but betrayal and death and murder, and then at the end, at least there's this glimmer of hope.
There is this beautiful evocation of, Christ throughout the story. And what we see is through, of all the characters, Peter Finnegan as this character of resurrection. And this, also works with Finnegan's Wake, which is, of course, the Joyce novel, but it's also an old song, which is about someone who comes back to life in a wake after being sung a song. And, you have this resurrection and this resurrection of hope. And we see a lot of dystopian fiction about people who are the exceptional heroes who, battle against the forces of oppression, and they end up, saving the day, and everything goes back to normal. But, it's usually by force or by violence or by coercion. Here we just see hope as this incredible thing that people held on to, something that Skreemer, because of his circumstances being a tortured child, never had. And it ends with this incredible empathetic view where Skreemer is kind of a pathetic character. Despite the grim and violent nature of his actions, you get to see that he was just a scared boy all along. And again, that notion of cracking the future, of breaking the idea of destiny, it's very ambiguous. Maybe Skreemer could see the future, and maybe there were, implications that, maybe he did see his end in the abyss of falling off the edge of the steps and he had to complete it, and he did it this way. Or maybe he just wanted to believe that. He needed to believe it so much that that's what caused him to, in the end, to take his own life. And because it's left ambiguous. The story lets the reader make that decision for their own self, but it ends with this idea where characters have this incredible dignity. They're able to walk away from situations, and through the birth of this unnamed child. Well, actually, I do believe the child is named at the very end. But the grandchild of Peter Finnegan ends up being this beacon of hope, and this beacon that we don't see. It's just incredible. Mike, I think some people consider this more of a minor work for Milligan. I was pleasantly surprised. Aside from a few nitpicks here and there, I found this to be a rejuvenatingly incredible post-apocalyptic story that talks about just the tenacity of a human heart to be able to fight against the worst and most dire situations. And I would say by the end of this, you talked about how timely it is. I think I needed a story like this to remind me, there is a reason to keep hope alive. And I think it's powerful. It's not saccharine. It's a very cynical story at the same time, but I think it does an incredible job at telling a mature story that maybe there's a few nitpicks here and there, but on the whole, I really like this.
Well, and there's the other biblical allusion I don't think we mentioned was the constant reference to giants.
Ah, yes.
There were giants in those days. We didn't really talk about that, but anyway, that's just a minor thing. But I think, I think this just shows a humanity that I don't see with Miller at all. And I do see it with Ennis, but so far in what I've read, not as much. It is very hopeful. And what I like about the climax is that because it's ambiguous about whether he can see the future or not, the fact that he overcomes that, at least the audience can use it as an analogy for overcoming your own. It's almost like the analogy is you're tied to your own belief system. And then when something shatters that, you have that feeling of freedom that now you can do whatever you want to do because you're not held back by this belief anymore, whether it's literally being able to see the future or just being held down by like an idea.
No, exactly. I also really love the characterization of Victoria because in the initial parts of the story, you do feel for her. Mm-hmm. Like initially when you meet her, she's having Dutch tortured. So, there is this clear vilification of her. But then as the story goes on, you understand her motivations and maybe you have some empathy. But then by the end, you see she could be just as violent as Skreemer was. And there's this setup where, if Dutch stuck around with her, he could see the same thing that happened to Skreemer to her. And he walks away. And we don't really know what's going to come of her. She may not be as deplorable as him, but, ethically, like, is the role going to be any better with her in that? Like, she's still going to be a despot. So there's a lot of things to ask about that, a lot of questions that are left unanswered. And I think that's for the better.
Right. I definitely agree. This is not a minor work. I think it's an excellent debut by Peter Milligan, and I'm glad that it was reprinted by Vertigo. And because at least that gives it a chance to have a wider audience then and also now with it being in trade paperback form.
Agreed. I would say we brought up evocations of Walkman. Not the Walkman, that's different, but of Watchmen. But I say if you liked Watchmen, there's a lot here that you would enjoy. I would even say, as much as, I infamously talk a lot about Ennis here, I really did love his run on Hellblazer. And I see a lot of similarity between this and that. And I think Milligan's writing style, sometimes I had to tear myself away and realize, I'm almost getting into like a flow or rhythm of the prose where it's like, is this Grant Morrison? Did he guest on one issue? Mm-hmm. Like the prose is that good. It's amazing. And I would say of everything we've read, this is in like the top echelon so far for the series.
I agree. And also it's hard for me to place where Peter Milligan is in other people's view because he's probably the least famous of the Vertigo founders. Mm-hmm. But I came into his work through Batman, so I always liked Peter Milligan because of that. Have you ever read his Batman run?
No, I've read stuff that he's done on Hellblazer, and I've read Shade the Changing Man.
Well, thankfully we have a podcast dedicated to everything ever written by a British writer, because we will be reviewing Peter Milligan's Batman issues in the near future.
Ooh.
Yeah. Okay. But anyway, that being said, thank you, Adam, for summarizing the entire series. Yes, as I said, I did not give this book the attention it deserved, that's for sure. It's definitely not something you can read, on the bus or while you're washing your dishes or whatever, like in the background. I don't know how you can read something like that, but you get my point. You got to give it full attention. It's very dense, it's very complex, and it asks a lot of the reader, and it gives a lot to the reader. So it's definitely worth a read if you can check it out. Skreemer, Skreemer, by Peter Milligan, Brett Ewins, and Steve Dillon. Highly recommended. And like you said, definitely one of the best books we've read so far. Excellent. So next episode, we are going to be reviewing our second part of the Captain Britain run by Alan Moore and Alan Davis. So be sure to join us, everybody. That's going to be out in 2 weeks. And I guess that's it. I want to thank you for joining me, Adam. Unfortunately, Paul couldn't be with us, but hopefully he'll be with us next time. And that's it.
That'll be great. Until then, keep it real, everybody, and keep reading good comics.
Awesome. Okay. See you later.